you are a Squaresoft fan that hasn't heard of Bahamut Lagoon, I wouldn't be surprised. This Super Famicom gem was titled Final Fantasy Tactics Behind Closed Doors, and that should give you at least a small idea of what to expect. While you won't find the same level of political intrigue or character customization here, if you're willing to delve into the dubious world of fan translations, you can still experience a solid strategy RPG that isn't afraid to take risks. Bahamut Lagoon has a rather distinct art style that kinda took some getting used to. It took me a long time to understand why. I finally feel like I discovered the issue, however, and it comes down to the fact that some of the art assets kind of clash with one another. Don't get me wrong, I came to love the design eventually, and I think the game looks good overall, but something about the highly detailed stills of the dragons against the rather plain backdrops of the battlefield seemed off. Even more so when you compare it to the more cartoony though highly detailed character battle sprites with their limited and unnatural, but somehow still aesthetically pleasing animation. Then there's the fact that the small tokens used for battlefield navigation sometimes share very little with their in-battle sprites. This makes it all feel just a bit jumbled, really. All of these parts taken separately, however, are at the least good. I love how the dragons can resemble any number of creatures and that they don't always look nice. Some of them are downright ugly, and that contrast truly makes them feel like they are creatures that shouldn't be trifled with. The small character sprites for between battles take the usual Square Super Nintendo style and refine it, giving more detail and more realistic proportions to the characters. Things like characters having their sprite thin below the waist to better represent legs. I know it is such a small detail, but I felt it helped to bring a more defined style to this title than most of the era. I love the colors of the backgrounds, I love how beautifully the sky is rendered and how it looks both awe-inspiring but also mysterious. The game did so much right in terms of presentation that I just can't help but love it, even with the previously mentioned issues. The music initially left me with similarly mixed feelings. For a 30-hour game, I felt the soundtrack to be a bit too short and repetitive, which given this game's slow nature is a bit of a disappointment. The songs on offer are decent at least, but there are only a few standout tracks while the rest fall into the serviceable category. Songs like JoJo and the God Dragons and the Aquiland Maharu are great at setting the intended tone and are pleasant to listen to. I especially love the uncreatively named Battle 2, which takes the main battle theme and alters it just enough to make it feel a great deal more imposing. I love when musical tracks are used this way. The music is very fitting overall, and as I listened to the soundtrack again, I found that I remembered every track, which is a mark in the game's favor, I guess. I just wish there had been a bit more of it. My only true gripe with the presentation comes down to some of the sound effects used in-game, specifically when it comes to menu navigation. I found them to be ear-gratingly annoying, and though I did eventually get used to them, they were still unpleasant given the rest of the game's level of polish. Bahamut Lagoon's gameplay is a unique hybrid of the usual Square RPG and strategy game that works surprisingly well. Between each mission, you'll be given the opportunity to walk through an area to speak with your crew, upgrade your equipment, and feed your dragons. These moments create a great fix to one of the biggest problems in strategy games as a whole by actually providing you with downtime. And trust me, you will need that downtime. With an army of 24 active combatants, you will spend a lot of time properly setting up and equipping your team. Each member only has 2 equipment slots, one for weapon and one for armor, but because of the size of your crew, that still ends up being expensive. In addition to your crew, you have to be sure to attend to your dragons. You do this by feeding them your excess equipment and other items you find or purchase throughout your journey. This was the most addicting part of the whole game for me, as raising your dragons can actually cause them to evolve, and because your dragon and your crew share a link with one another, the stronger your dragon becomes, the stronger your party becomes as well. Does your dragon have a maxed out fire stat? Well, if he does, prepare to get a huge bonus whenever your party uses a fire elemental ability. The formation of your troops also plays a surprisingly deep role in the game. You don't so much customize your characters as you customize the groups they work with to try and make a powerful synergy between them. Much like the bond with the dragons, the characters share a bond with one another. If you put, for example, 4 wizards together, then when they cast a spell from a distance, all 4 will cast at once, thus making the spell 4 times more powerful than it generally would be. This effectively transforms a level 10 spell into a level 40 one, but there are other factors that make this a more difficult decision. You can put 4 heavy armor knights together to have a strong front line, but their movement speed will be pretty abysmal. Do you try and work around the issue with strategy, or do you take a hit to your overall attack power to pair them with a much faster light armor knight that will increase the entire party's movement radius? There's so many factors that need to be considered and several different viable strategies. I spent almost as much time making sure that all of my crew and dragons were properly optimized as I did on the battlefield. If you are not okay with micromanagement, this is likely not the game for you. Combat is pretty standard for the most part. It's a turn-based affair where you move your units to the desired position and then attack if the opportunity presents itself. The interesting thing about Bahamut Lagoon, however, is that you have the option of attacking from a distance, which keeps yourself out of harm's way but causes you to do potentially less damage. On the other hand, you can attack directly, entering a secondary battle screen that looks more like your standard RPG, offering you the ability to do more damage but also take some in return. There's more give and take here than it initially appears, however, as defeating enemies from a distance will only net you half the money you would otherwise get from attacking head-on. Added to this is your rather limited MP pool, which means you truly do have to be strategic about when and where you plan your attacks. Easily Bahamut Lagoon's most unique feature is its dragons, which fight with you in battle but aren't under your direct control, instead relying on extremely vague commands to have them move far away, stay close to their handler, or go somewhere to hide. While they very rarely make the most beneficial choices in combat, I was actually surprised by how competent the AI made them act overall. Even with their immense power, however, you do have to be careful with how you command them. Because of the previously mentioned bond between the dragons and party members, if your dragon falls in battle, your human fighters will become dramatically crippled in terms of attack and defense power, making it so you can't rely on them to do all the work. The combat gets even deeper still when you take into account Bahamut Lagoon's use of terrain, which is interactive. Forests can be burned down to stop them from hindering your movement speed or hurt enemies and allies that are standing in them. Bridges and other stone formations can be destroyed with lightning spells, and bodies of water can actually be frozen to make them passable. Even poisonous swamps can be neutralized with a well-placed healing spell. At first glance, I thought the system felt gimmicky, but I was surprised how often I ended up using these tactics to my advantage. The enemy also uses the terrain to its advantage, however. Or, more correctly, the developers did. Some of the most fun and challenging maps in the game had me going up against fully fortified bases. Obstacles like walls I had to destroy before passing, or the auto-attack cannons had a devastating effect on my troops, and finding the best way to overcome these obstacles was a huge part of the fun. It truly felt like I was attacking the enemy on their home turf because I was at such a large disadvantage, but the feeling of accomplishment from actually conquering these more challenging maps made me feel elated. I also found the difficulty curve to be just about perfect. I didn't need to grind at all, and yet by the end of the game, all of my dragon stats were nearly maxed out, and all of my recruits were decked out with the best equipment money could buy. Even with that level of preparation, I still found the last few chapters to be challenging without being unfair. The only downsides I can think of in terms of the gameplay is that things can feel a bit too slow, but as this is a strategy title, that is a fairly common issue. The other issue is there isn't a lot of variety in terms of attack types. Every character class in the game gets one attack per element, and it can leave things feeling a bit samey, though that is at least slightly alleviated by the fact that proper use of all these techniques is still the main driving force in terms of the game's strategy. It was one of those games that even with the large time investment required for each battle, I kept telling myself just one more, until it was 4 AM each night. Bahamut Lagoon's story takes place in a world of floating continents that have been taken over by a man known as Emperor Saucer. Your goal as the hero is to lead a resistance movement to bring freedom back to the people of the world. While not exactly a novel starting point, the story evolves from there rather quickly into a race to find the holy dragons, that's not to be confused with the regular dragons that you already fight with, train, and breed, and to save the world from a great calamity. The story isn't exactly a strong point in Bahamut Lagoon, but it does have enough to keep you interested as you play. That being said, I don't feel that it flows quite as well as it reasonably should. The ending arc with the calamities led into rather smoothly, but things are just sort of thrown at you from then on. Once again, it was hard for me to put my finger on what exactly made the experience feel lacking, but I think it came down to the lack of connection between the heroes and the actual final boss. Without spoiling too much, I think the best way to describe it would be to compare it to the older Final Fantasy games, where you would defeat the person you thought was the villain, only to have a completely random godlike creature thrown at you in the end for a good measure. Bahamut Lagoon's ending fight is not a random creature per se, and in fact you know for a good chunk of the game the battle is coming, but there's no real build-up or intimidation. It's just an obstacle you know you will have to overcome at some point, despite it never really having done the players any harm directly. That being said, it's still a worthy spectacle and a fun fight, so I guess there's no real harm done. The story is far more character-focused than event-focused anyway, and that is where Bahamut Lagoon succeeds. The game contains a huge cast of playable characters, more than 30, and while not all of them are fully fleshed out or have a large backstory, they all have a distinct personality that made them feel alive. Characters like Frederica with her medicine addiction or Donphan with his over-the-top flirting aren't all that important to the story, but still remain memorable because of how comedically written they were. I was actually sad to see the inseparable duo Reeve and Friends fighting with one another throughout the story. These moments, while arguably unimportant, gave me a rather strong attachment to my crew, and that's without talking about the characters who are important to the game's story, such as the warrior and mentor Matlight, General Papalios, and the Princess Yo-Yo, whom the story is most centered around. Just make sure to watch out for Sendak. There's just something not quite right about that old man. Yeah, that's a thing that happens. Even the shopkeepers have their own little story arc, and it just felt amazing to watch it all develop as the game went on. In this regard, I think Bahamut Lagoon is a huge success. Even the outstanding Final Fantasy Tactics struggled with this, making the main characters you can recruit silent and completely unimportant as soon as their story arc is over. Speaking of silence, there's something I really need to get off my chest. I hate silent protagonists in gaming, especially RPGs. I firmly stand by the idea that there's nothing lazier than leaving a character speechless. And no, I don't agree with the stupid argument that it helps to make you project onto the character. I firmly believe that if a character is well written, even if they are nothing like me or anyone else I've met in my entire life, that I will be able to relate to them much better than I ever would a blank slate. It is a trope that not only never benefits the games it's shown in, but generally actively hurts the game's storytelling. And just to clear things up, because, well, this is the internet and things are taken far too literally, I don't mean characters who just don't have voice acting like in Dragon Age Origins. There is no actual voice there, but you are still choosing the dialogue options, thus your main character isn't silent. No, I'm talking about characters like Link from The Legend of Zelda or Chrono from Chrono Trigger. The characters that stare blankly at the world around them while everything else just kind of reacts. To my dismay, Bahamut Lagoon does fall into this trope, and I do feel that it hurts the storytelling a bit, but not as much as I would have expected. While the main character never speaks without player input, every line of dialogue spoken by him is in fact chosen by the player. These don't create story-altering decisions like they would in a game like Mass Effect, but it does lend authenticity to you actually being this character, not just watching the world happen around as a characterless token. While still not perfect, this was an aspect that I thoroughly enjoyed. While the main plot isn't all that gripping, there are a few character moments and risky decisions the game's story made that I want to cover now. However, these definitely fall into the spoiler category, so skip to this point if you want to avoid any serious plot points. While I already said Bahamut Lagoon doesn't do anything groundbreaking with its story, it does do a few small things that most other games wouldn't dare to do, and that's part of why I love it so much. For example, despite the game heavily hinting at it for the first few chapters, the hero does not end up with the princess. In fact, you are flat out rejected for General Papalios, another knight who is actually working on the enemy's team before switching sides. This isn't a ploy either, or some form of competition between the hero and him. Papalios just flat out gets the girl, and you have to sit on the sideline while you watch their relationship develop. There is no side relationship either. Your character ends up alone by the end of the game, separated not only from the princess, but also from his friends as he spends the rest of his days flying around on his dragon to protect the skies between lagoons. Bahamut Lagoon doesn't exactly have a happy ending. The princess becomes queen because of her father's death and separates herself from her friends for her responsibilities. Papalios is assassinated and the hero rushes off to be alone. The world is saved and all the minor heroes have a much happier send-off, but the main trio all have rather unsatisfactory endings, which is something else that I appreciated. As I already stated, Bahamut Lagoon never left Japan, and because of that I had to rely on a fan translation to play this game in English. And this game's fan translation is actually rather professional for the most part, with the only exception being some self-appreciative snippets of dialogue within the game. They even went as far as to edit in their own sound test that you can view by discovering a secret button combination in the game. I actually read over the translator's notes and found the level of detail rather impressive, going so far as to give different characters their own sort of dialect, and while I didn't think that it all came through quite as clearly as the translator may have wanted, I would say that falls more on the lack of dialogue for certain characters and on the translators themselves. Bahamut Lagoon was the first fan-translated game I ever played, and I can honestly say that it still holds up as one of the best examples of one. So thank you Tomato, Dark Force, and Neil Corlett for your dedication to this project and many others, and thank you for introducing me to the amazing world of fan translations as a whole. Ever since first playing this translated gem, I have made it a goal to support every fan translation I can find. All things considered, I really enjoyed Bahamut Lagoon in terms of its storytelling. It flowed well between comedy and drama, though I did honestly feel its comedic moments were far more impactful, and it has a large cast of characters I was happy to come to know and love. I played Bahamut Lagoon for the first time about 5 years ago, and I remembered liking it, but had assumed that my opinion of the game was higher than the game likely deserved. I was happily surprised to find that the game holds up quite a bit better than I would have expected, and given that I just got done playing the wildly variant but generally abysmal Mana series of games for the same company, this was a doubly surprising change. I truly do feel it is a hidden gem that more people should play if you were into the strategy genre. I wish the game had been officially localized, but given that it came out in February of 1996, more than a year after the initial launch of the original PlayStation, I can assume that it was never translated due to the shift to the latter console. Even so, I still wish this game had come out officially here in some capacity so fans weren't forced to translate it themselves. You Square indeed.